I think Angola has been one of the most promising countries of growth over the past 7 to 8 years. With the end of the conflict, of course, there was huge potential for not just recovery, but for dramatic growth, and we've seen that come through. Between 2003 and 2008, the country grew at 17% per annum, and they held that pace for 5 years. I think they were the third fastest growing country in the world. So it's not just a 1 or 2 year blip, you're talking about a sustained breakneck speed growth for 5 years, and we expect them to get back to a similar trend, maybe not 17%, but clearly, as you say, 8%, 9%. Of course, the interesting thing about Angola is it's not just a story of oil and natural gas.
Let's get into that, because I mean the projections that we are seeing are based on higher oil prices forming a big part of that growth driver, and after the 2009 year depleted its foreign currency reserves, it's actually cemented just how dependent Angola is on oil revenue at this stage. So to what extent are we seeing a diversification of that economy?
Well, I think the truth is that you do have a high level of dependency. About close to 60% of the GDP comes from oil and gas. But I think the interesting story is the very high levels of growth we're seeing in other sectors. The construction sector, the tourism sector to some extent, manufacturing as well. Of course, given that the country imports 80% of its consumables, there's a huge domestic demand for a number of products that the country should be able to produce domestically, and that's happening. So we're seeing a lot of growth in non-traditional sectors, like the ones that I've mentioned, that suggest that Angola is on the path to diversification. But it's not easy, of course, and there is the danger of the Dutch disease, as Nigeria has shown and other countries have shown in the past. When you have a very strong sector like oil or diamonds or any kind of mineral wealth, it generates that kind of problem for your exchange rates, and then you sort of crowd out other sectors.
Of course, I've been reading that what's been holding Angola is in good stead is that it's in a completely different position today than it was a while ago, and it's set to resume investments, as you say, in the non-oil sector, which will further stimulate economic growth. From that investment perspective, take us through the Development Bank of Southern Africa's involvement in Angolan projects specifically at this moment.
Well, our portfolio at the moment doesn't have a very large component of Angolan assets. We've approved record levels of investments and financing for Angolan projects for the past 24 months. We're in the process of converting those to commitments, meaning to sign the legal agreements and then to disperse the funding. We also have a very, very strong pipeline of new projects that are underway in the infrastructure sectors, but also in other sectors that the government is giving huge priority to.
Like
housing. Housing is a very good example. Housing is a particular sector where the government has given a very big push. There's talk of 1 million houses that the president apparently has committed to, and a lot of that is going to be urban-based. As you may know, the city of Luanda is highly urbanized and also represents almost half of the population of the whole country. A lot of pent-up demand for housing, a lot of historical issues to do with the conflict, of course. Lots of poor people who don't have access to housing, but the government is giving a huge push. We've undertaken to support some of those programs, so we've got a couple of very large projects that we're looking at to support the government in this new push. And of course, housing is a very, very good complement to infrastructure.
Yeah.
So when we talk about power and roads and water, housing is really just part and parcel of that kind of
While that
approach.
is underway, and while you get more involved in this territory as you see that side of your portfolio grow, what have you found to be the major challenges doing business in Angola?
Well, Angola is a country coming out of a difficult past. The institutional framework is not very straightforward, and it takes a little bit of time to get through it. I guess, like many countries, you need to invest in terms of getting to understand the way the government works, the business culture, the institutional framework. So there's an element of understanding the terrain, but there's also an element of trying to get over some of the hurdles that one finds, which is not the same that you would find in other countries. So I can't go into details in this kind of discussion, but it's not an easy place necessarily to do business, but the potential is huge, and there's a lot a lot of space, I think, for good business.
When it comes to that understanding, I mean, I touched on earlier that we saw the drop in oil prices in 2009 put the economy on a very difficult position, and it eventually led to the government cutting spending on the one hand, but also postponing repayment of $6.8 billion in arrears to construction companies that helped rebuild infrastructure after the end of civil war in 2002. To what extent has that acted as a deterrent to sentiment, and so the work to rebuild that investor confidence all that much harder at this stage?
The truth is I really can't comment on that. I'm not very closely associated with that experience, so I wouldn't be able to say much. All I can say is I've heard that there's been some resolution of those issues. So yes, I suppose to the extent that that was a problem, it does have an effect on appetite. But for us, we've not experienced that because we're in a different business. We're on the financing side, actually, not on the construction side.
We've got the IPAD Angola conference underway in September. What message will you be taking to the Angolan business community?
There is huge interest in the world for very good reasons. I think Angolans know that. I think it's a question of finding the right partnerships, getting to the level of understanding that will allow people to take risks together. That's the bottom line, really.